The Aespa fandom often brags about how Aespa is the only group that stays true to their identity and doesn't hop on trends, and I highly disagree with that statement, because if that were true, they'd still be doing the AE Avatar concept. They'd still be in Kwangya professing their love for Naevis.
Naevis, we love you.
Ning Ning and Winter would be belting a random high note in their songs, but it's been years since they stopped doing those things. Aespa has changed their style and sound multiple times until they finally found the one that worked the best. It's just that either people ignored the times they did change their style and sound, or those comebacks were too irrelevant to matter in the grand scheme of things. So today I want to talk about Naevis and Kwangya and why Aespa abandoned that concept. By now we are all aware they have long dropped it, but I want to talk about why. A brief history of Kwangya if you're a newer K-pop fan watching this video. When Aespa debuted in 2020, they came with a whole fictional universe attached. AI alter egos, a digital parallel world called Kwangya, a villain called Black Mamba, and a guide character named Naevis, who existed as a digital being tied to their story. They also tried to create a signature sound to match the concept, something glitchy, mechanical, and deliberately strange. The whole idea of it worked. It had people curious and talking about Aespa when they debuted, and they were performing well for a new group, especially in South Korea, earning perfect OQs on the charts. Next Level and Savage were everywhere. I wouldn't call those songs good, but it was very loved in Korea. The Kwangya world was the entire foundation of who they were. It was a core part of their sound and identity. Founder and ex-CEO Lee Soo-man was behind the idea like he has been for every other SM groups prior. They stuck with that concept for some years until the company decided to push them internationally, and that decision kind of changed everything. The first sign that things were changing came with My World era in 2023, specifically with Spicy. Spicy was a complete tonal break from everything Aespa had done before. It was still a loud EDM sound, but it wasn't as jumbled and messy as their previous songs. Visually, it was also bright and clean with little to no CGI compared to their previous works. There was no Kwangya references, no AE members, and the members weren't battling any entities. It looks like four normal girls existing in a normal physical location on Earth, which compared to what Aespa had been doing was basically a foreign concept. People said it was still part of the Kwangya lore, with the arguments that the Black Mamba had been defeated, and they left Kwangya to come to Earth. That Kwangya was never abandoned, just temporarily set aside as the group returned to the real world to take a break, which I guess makes sense considering the first song on the album is titled Welcome to My World. But in my opinion, I think that SM was testing what Aespa looks like without the concept attached and seeing if people would still care or still show up for it. Aespa isn't the first SM group to abandon their lore. It's happened with almost all their groups, but I feel like Aespa has happened quite earlier compared to others. Then Drama came later that year, doubling down on this loud, more strict EDM sound. Still no AE members, still no Naevis. In early 2023, Lee Soo-man was forced out of SM Entertainment following a management dispute after Kakao's takeover. He eventually left and started another agency, with his longtime producer, Yoo Young-jin, following him out the door shortly after. Those two were the creative core of the Kwangya universe. Lee Soo-man had built it from scratch. Yoo Young-jin's production was all over the sound. He is responsible for the SM sound. When they both left, the concept lost the people who fully understood where it was going. And let's not forget that before Lee Soo-man left, he publicly stated that he had been delaying Aespa's releases because he wanted to add themes about environmental sustainability and tree planting into their songs. Ideas the group was reportedly not happy about because they didn't fit the world they were building at all. So even before his exit, the creative vision for Kwangya was already rotten from the inside. The creator of the concept was starting to become its biggest obstacle. After he left, SM had a group but no active creative blueprint for the universe they had been building, and a new leadership team with very different set priorities. Those priorities were Western expansion, and to understand why it killed Kwangya, you need to understand just how badly SM had been failing internationally for years. SM Entertainment has been trying to crack the Western market for a long time, longer than most people remember. They've pushed several SM groups and artists to the point of creating supergroups specifically for the West, but none of them crossed over into actual mainstream Western pop success. They stayed inside the K-pop bubble. Around the earlier 2020s, almost all the major companies had a group that was at least famous in the West. YG had Blackpink. Hype had BTS, The Seraphim, New Jeans, TXT. JYP had Twice and Stray Kids. SM, however, had no major group that the Western audience cared about. So in SM's last desperate bid to get a group to break into the Western market, they invested everything into Aespa. Aespa had performed at Coachella in 2022, and Girls debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200, which was impressive. But a high album chart debut from a K-pop group is often just the dedicated fandom buying in bulk. It doesn't mean they have broken into the Western market. The general public didn't really care for Aespa or other SM groups like they did for groups from other K-pop companies. They're not a group that could be recognized or named by someone who wasn't into K-pop. They were beloved within the K-pop world but invisible outside of it. And this is the uncomfortable truth that SM had to face. The Kwangya concept, as great and unique as it was never gonna be the thing that broke Aespa into the Western mainstream. Kwangya was never gonna work in the West. The Western audience couldn't care less about lore. You can't use the fact that they have a specific lore and specific sound for why their music is the way it is. No one outside K-pop cares about all that. They're not gonna go home and read about the SM culture universe before deciding whether they like a group. The very thing that made Kwangya exciting to K-pop stans was the exact thing that would have made it impossible to market to a casual Western audience, which SM was aiming for. Beyond the lore, the sound itself was a major problem. The early Aespa sound was deliberately strange. It was grating in ways that even K-pop fans found polarizing at times. Next Level and Savage were pretty hated outside Korea until they started performing well on Korean charts. K-pop stans have this thing they do where a song's performance on Korean charts dictates whether they consider the song good or not, and that's usually the case for Aespa. Their songs are considered bad until they perform well on Korean charts, and if they don't, then it's universally agreed that is bad. Anyways, back to the topic of Aespa's sound. That kind of experimental sound has an audience, but it's not a mainstream Western pop audience. Western pop radio in the early 2020s was dominated by clean, melodic, emotionally direct music. Random beat changes, screeching high notes, and weird beats weren't gonna cut it. So when SM decided they wanted Aespa to be their main vehicle for Western expansion, they had to fundamentally change what Aespa sounded like and what Aespa was about. And that's exactly what they did. The same SM fans who are quick to criticize other groups for abandoning their identities and chasing trends have been remarkably quiet about the fact that Aespa did exactly that. I just had to call out that hypocrisy because there is not one group out there right now that hasn't hopped on trends with the goal of going viral. Like I promise you, K-pop companies don't want their groups to be unsuccessful. The Western push started becoming visible with the My World era, like I said before, and then got even more serious very quickly. But before all of that, SM's first real attempt to push Aespa into Western territory was through straightforward pop. They put out English language pop singles like Better Things and Life's Too Short, and those did not work. They failed both in Korea and in the West. The so-called strategy of releasing English songs did not produce the same results for Aespa, so SM pivoted to a different approach. Since pop didn't work out, they leaned into a harder, more electronic, high-energy sound that could theoretically appeal everywhere at once. Like, it's kind of had a little bit of that Aespa vibe, but wasn't as messy and random as their previous Kwangya-related works. Like, at least it didn't have random beat drops and changes that sounded like completely different songs. So it was palatable to the average K-pop fan that wasn't a fan of that type of experimental music. This is the era that gave us Spicy and Drama, which sat in that dance pop and EDM adjacent space, accessible enough for casual listeners, but still incorporates Aespa's loud, messy beats. Both songs did reasonably well and started pushing Aespa in the right direction internationally. Then came Supernova in 2024, and this is when the breakthrough really happened. Supernova went viral in a way that none of their previous releases had done. It took off on social media, generated an enormous amount of attention, and performed well for SM Group standards on global streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple Music, earning them their first songs with over 2 million daily streams on Spotify. It was also dominating in Korea. SM had finally cracked the code with them after multiple failed attempts. Whiplash followed later and continued the momentum. Whiplash is their most viral song outside the K-pop space and one of their overall best chart performance on all metrics. However, working partially is not the same as working the way SM envisioned it. Supernova and Whiplash pushed Aespa to peaks that they had never reached before. The streaming numbers were better, the global chart performance was better, but Aespa still had not broken through to the actual general public in the West. They were still fundamentally inside the K-pop bubble. They were doing better within that bubble than they ever had, and that bubble had grown significantly larger thanks to the overall K-pop boom, but they had not crossed the line into Western mainstream pop the way other K-pop groups had. After the partial success of Supernova and Whiplash, SM clearly decided that good was not good enough and pushed for another gear shift. Armageddon, Dirty Work, Rich Man, and Whole Different Animal all represented a move away from the EDM sound that had been working and into something with more hip-hop and hard rock influence. This made sense as a theory. American mainstream music has always had more space for hip-hop inflected sounds than for the kind of hyperpop EDM that characterized Supernova and Whiplash. If the goal was to attract the American general public, shifting towards something with a harder, more rap-driven sound and more Western production sensibilities seemed logical. I like to include Armageddon as part of their hip-hop attempt despite it being in between Supernova and Whiplash because that song doesn't give the same EDM vibes as them. It was probably SM's first test into the hip-hop waters. Dirty Work was their first major hip-hop influenced release with over 98% English lyrics. It was a massive failure and very hated even in the K-pop community. It just didn't work. Rich Man, with its rock and hip-hop influences and a concept inspired by a Cher quote, generated some attention but did not produce another Supernova-level viral moment. Whole Different Animal had their audiences but did not cross over. The hip-hop pivot did not pull the American listeners that the strategy was designed to reach, and it alienated them again from the Korean audience. It just created a period of Aespa's discography that was trying noticeably hard to sound like something and landing somewhere slightly uncomfortable in the middle. The trajectory has been quite interesting to watch. They tried English pop and it failed. They tried EDM adjacent sound and got partial success. They tried hip-hop and hard rock and failed again, and now we're back to the EDM adjacent with Lemonade. Each pivot was an attempt to find the format that would fully crack the Western market open, and each time the Western market largely shrugged. Which brings us to Lemonade, their most recent album release. And the most telling thing about Lemonade is what it sounds like. It sounds like Whiplash and Supernova. We're back to the EDM sound after testing the hip-hop space. It sounds like they looked at their entire post-Kwangya discography, identified the era that performed best both domestically and internationally, and decided to build from there again, or in Stan Twitter terms, they are reheating their own nachos. The lead single, Lemonade, is especially similar to Whiplash, their biggest song. The production sits in the same electronic metallic high energy space. Chart-wise, Lemonade also performed better than the hip-hop influenced song Whole Different Animal. And that is probably where Aespa is gonna stay for a while. The Supernova and Whiplash era represents the best they have performed chart-wise, and the closest they had come to international recognition. Going back to something in that lane is a sensible commercial choice. The experiments with the Western pop singles failed, the hip-hop pivot failed. The thing that actually moved numbers was a specific kind of hard, fast electronic sound that has a little of the Aespa sound but is also accessible enough for casual listening. So they're going back to that. Whether that is creative evolution or just finding the most profitable and commercially successful formula and sticking to it is probably a matter of perspective. Like personally, I prefer their EDM songs the best out of all the genres they've tried. In summary, Aespa abandoned Kwangya because the man who built it got pushed out of the company, because the new leadership had investor productions that required international market growth, because the Kwangya concept was structurally incompatible with the Western mainstream audience that SM was chasing, and because a series of commercial experiments eventually identified a different sound that worked better for those goals. I feel like if the transition wasn't successful, we probably would have been back in Kwangya by now. As for Naevis, she debuted as a soloist in 2024. Maybe SM plans to keep the Kwangya universe alive through her. I do wonder the direction they would take for their next comeback, because they can't keep doing the EDM sound. At some point, I think people will grow stale and tired of it. So will they keep giving us the Whiplash copies? Will they finally let go of the hip-hop songs? Will they try pop again? Or will they go back to Kwangya? We shall see.